Hi, this is Katie Sweetman with Empowering Astrology, and this is another webinar. Thank you all for joining me this evening, and this one is on the astrology of 2020. So we are not only in a new year, we're also in a new decade. So what can we expect? What are the major themes that we are experiencing overall, but also how are they affecting each sign? So just and as I record this, it's January 7th, 2020. Again, my name is Katie Sweetman. I am here in Brooklyn, New York. I am an astrologer and also a psychic medium. I've been seeing clients for the last about 8 years at this point, but I did start Empowering Astrology on January 9th, 2010. So it's almost a 10-year birthday for Empowering Astrology. I did it because at the time, it didn't feel like there was the voice that I wanted or the conversation that I wanted to have with astrology. And so, you know what they say, like if somebody's not doing it, you got to do it yourself. So that's when I created Empowering Astrology. And I see astrology as this very powerful tool to kind of open up our awareness and help us to live, let's say, more in harmony with these kind of greater forces that are both outside of us, but also within us. This is just a quick rundown of the agenda. This is just for those that are watching on the replay, want to get a little pause, want to kind of see what the structure is. So let's kind of talk some big overall themes for 2020. And you know, I included this image. For me, it's very much about big picture systems, networks, and I really feel that these kind of systems and networks and structures are going to continue to be big themes in 2020. And I think it's also really important to understand that 2020 is not some sort of standalone year. Neither was 2019. They're all part of this continued story. Especially, I would say 2020 is part of a story that started in 2008. And if you've been listening to, some of the things that I've been putting out in my writings, on my website, Empowering Astrology, on Facebook, on Instagram, and in my live videos, I've been trying to paint this story for everybody, just to give a little bit more context for what we're experiencing right now and how it has its roots in 2008. And this is something that I will be going into a little bit more in a few moments. But the thing about what we're going through right now, especially with planets like Pluto and Saturn and Capricorn, is that we also have to look at the shadow side of these structures and systems. So the shadow side of power, the shadow side of control. So a lot of the focus of the astrology this year, it's taking place in the signs of Capricorn and Aquarius. And if you know a little bit about astrology, Capricorn and Aquarius are two of the last signs of the zodiac. They're not the very last. That honor goes to Pisces. But when you are getting to the latter signs of the zodiac, Capricorn represents structure, it's government, it's that's on a, let's say, a bigger macro level. On a personal level, it's our ambitions, it's the responsibilities that we have, it's the place that we have in the world. And then connected to the next sign over, Aquarius, it's a sign that talks about systems and networks and the systems that we're a part of, the networks that we're a part of, our social circles. It also talks about our hopes and dreams and wishes for the future. So, that said, both Aquarius and Capricorn are what are called Saturn-ruled signs. It's really about big picture, manifestation, the structures that are both visible, Capricorn, and invisible, Aquarius, because by the way, Aquarius is what's called an air sign. It talks about communication, it talks about socialization and interaction, and kind of this dissemination of ideas. So that said, part of the story this year is shifting a little bit. We're going to see the eclipses start to go into Gemini, and Sagittarius. And that said, with the South Node going into Sagittarius, we are starting to do some collective work. And this is going to happen, I believe, around May, if I remember correctly. The nodes are the South Node's going to start to go into Sagittarius, that we need to look at our karma, our past, our instincts around belief. And what is our relationship with belief? And some of the beliefs that we have, let's say, held onto very strongly that might not be relevant or even true anymore. And I think that once Saturn goes into Aquarius in March, we're going to start to see this preview of a new time start to open up. One that's going to speak to these bigger social networks that we're a part of, our hopes and our dreams for the future, the bigger picture, thinking more about community and groups, and less about the self and more about the we. And so I think that with some of the really intense astrology that we're experiencing right now, and especially because Capricorn and Aquarius, you're kind of getting into these systems and networks and socialization, we are going to be seeing these themes in 2020 about what connects us and what divides us. Because as we start to move some of the narrative into Aquarius, and maybe if you're Aquarius or some Aquariuses as in your own life, it's a sign that on its highest level is about humanitarianism. It's about equality and equity, and in its lowest expression, it's almost the inhumanity. It's almost the disconnection from each other. So we're going to have to look at these deeper personal and societal themes around science and technology and how we connect to one another. So as I was saying a few moments ago, I really believe that 2020 has its roots, or the story has its roots in 2008. Why is that? So back in 2008, in January of 2008, Pluto went into Capricorn. This is an important fact to put in the back of your head, because Pluto, number one, had not been in Capricorn since 1770s. Yes, you read that correctly. Pluto is a planet that takes a while to make one revolution around the zodiac wheel, one revolution around the sun. And the analogy that I often use, it's like we were watching a hand on the clock start to point towards Capricorn. And, Pluto is non-negotiable transformation. So when it's in a sign, that sign has to completely transform. We have to completely transform Capricorn. We have to completely transform power and control. And you could say that Capricorn is a sign where its soul is being laid bare right now. We're seeing all the different permutations of Capricorn, from the highest and the lowest. But it's a sign that Capricorn in your chart represents some part of your life. Even if you have no planets in Capricorn, Capricorn is a part of your life. And that part of your life has demanded total transformation since 2008. And that part of your life, and as in even Capricorn on a macro level, we're going to continue to transform this part of our life and transform structures and government and power and control until 2023 and 2024. Pluto will spend in total 16 years in Capricorn. So when we get to 2023, 2024, and we look back at the life we had at the beginning of 2008, maybe even in particular that part of our life, it should be completely different. We have done some sort of deep transformation, deep evolution in that part of our life. And you're wondering, what does 2008 have to do with 2020? That was 12 years ago, which is a little bit hard to believe, but time is flying. So as I record this, we're in a very interesting month, January 2020. It's the month that, sorry, going backwards. It's the month that Saturn conjoins with Pluto. So I'll explain what that means in a moment. Back at the end of 2017, pretty much the beginning of 2018, Saturn went into Capricorn. And if Pluto, as a hand on the clock, has been pointing towards Capricorn since 2008, here comes another hand on the clock. And it's also pointing towards Capricorn. And both those hands on the clock, they move at different rates. So Pluto much more slowly. Capricorn, since the start of 2018, has been starting to catch up with Pluto. So Saturn finally reaches Pluto, making what's called a conjunction, which means the two planets are in the same place in the sky. They make that conjunction on January 12th, 2020. Now, this is the first time that Saturn and Capricorn have been together in the sky since November of 1982. If I didn't double check this, but I read somewhere that this is the first time Saturn and Pluto have been together in the sky since the 1500s. So there's that little fact. So I think that whatever began in 2008, Saturn is checking up on things. Now Saturn so if Pluto's function is to completely tear down, to transform, to evolve that sign, and we've been doing some really deep, powerful transformation work on a personal level since 2008. Here comes Saturn. Now Saturn in astrology, Saturn's function is to make sure we're doing our work, checking in on how this process is going. So you could almost say, like Saturn saying, okay, you know, what have you been doing since 2008? How have you evolved? How have you cleared space? How have you broken down these shadow structures within your life? How have you examined the depths of yourself, especially in that one part of your life? And maybe you have done powerful work since 2012. I'm sure you all have. So Saturn's like, great, fantastic. You've been doing your work. Let's say somebody else hasn't been doing their work. No judgment. But Saturn's like, okay, you've got some work to do. You have to really examine ... based on wherever this is in your life. And I think that for those who have been doing our work and to varying degrees, I think there's something about this time that crystallizes. You know, Saturn conjunct Pluto in the way is an ending. It's also a beginning. And so I think that there's also, and I don't think I put this in the slides, you know, something that I've been talking about with Saturn and Pluto together is I've been using this term called the wrecking ball, which I'm using that in like the best possible way, because I think that since this is a moment where things crystallize, you want to be really sure what you're not sort of adding to this kind of spiritual cement that's happening with Saturn and Pluto. So what do you want to break down right now? And I think really think about that as you go into 2020. What sort of addictions, what sort of negative emotional patterns, what sort of negative relationship patterns, maybe issues around self-worth. Like Pluto, because Pluto is in the mix here, Pluto always speaks to shadow work. What is shadow work? Shadow work is when we have to look at the part of ourselves that we normally don't want to look at. It's the part of ourselves that's in the shadow. It's the part of ourselves that sometimes makes decisions for us and we don't even realize it. It's the part of ourselves that actively works against us. So the more that we work on our shadow, the more that we release our shadow, the more that we transform our shadow, the more autonomy, the more freedom, the more sense of self we have, the more awareness of self that we have, because we're not getting sort of blindsided by the other half of ourselves that's kind of not playing for our team, so to speak. So I think that January, as we step into the new year, it's a really potent time to clear and also to kind of see what's sort of coming together after all our work over the last 12 years. Saturn, as I was saying, it's starting to reach the end of Capricorn. In fact, for those who are a little bit more plugged into the minutia of astrology, Saturn is going to join up with Pluto at 22 degrees of Capricorn. That said, Saturn's going to get to the last stretch of Capricorn in March of 2020. And it's my belief, I don't think I'm completely unique on this, it's my belief when Saturn, any planet gets to the end of the sign, it's a sort of, hey, what did you learn moment? But I think with Saturn getting to the end of Capricorn, we're gonna get a report card. I think each and every one of us is gonna get a report card in March. And Saturn saying, all right, I looked over your finances, I looked over your choices, I looked over your relationships, wherever Capricorn is in your chart. And this is the work that you have to do in order to step up to your highest potential. So that's March. And then what happens is Saturn will leave Capricorn for a few months. It'll come back on July 1st. It'll dip into Aquarius and it will retrograde back into Capricorn. And it's like, okay, great. What have you been doing in the last 3 months? Have you been working on the things that I told you that you still had to work on? So from July until December, we're working on those lessons. We're integrating the lessons that we've been learning, not just since the beginning of 2018 when Saturn went to Capricorn, but I think even the lessons we've been learning since January of 2008. January 2008, like I said, that was the month that Pluto entered Capricorn. Pluto did retrograde back out, just FYI, into Sagittarius. I think it was in the spring or the summer. I can't remember the exact date. Went back into Capricorn in the end of November of 2008. So that was a very pivotal year, nevertheless. So I think that Saturn's really, there's a referendum that's happening in 2020 on a lot of things. And I think that referendum on a personal level is what have we been doing over the last 12 years. So I think it's also important to make note that the eclipses this year, and also the eclipses last year, I shall say, they've been in the signs of Cancer and Capricorn. So yes, there's been a lot of things happening in Capricorn, in addition to Saturn and Capricorn, in addition to Pluto and Capricorn, in addition to Saturn conjunct Pluto and Capricorn, we've been having eclipses. So the south node of the moon has been in Capricorn, and we sort of opened up this time a couple of years ago where we are moving towards Cancer. So north node is in Cancer, meaning we need to have more heart, more soul. We need to relax. We need to make sure we're getting our needs met. We need, Cancer is like this substance that just, it acts like a balm for the soul. We need Cancer. We also need Capricorn. Capricorn balances things out. But the story right now is we need to take a really serious look, or we have been taking a serious look at where are these sort of negative structures in our life? Where do we get, stuck and imprisoned, work too hard? And where are our fears? Because Capricorn and Saturn and Capricorn on a shadow side of things can really speak to what we're afraid of. And maybe those fears can act like a limit or a barrier. We started this series back in July of 2018. We had a solar eclipse in Cancer on July 12th. Maybe for some of you that month, July or August of 2018 was pivotal, and it kind of signaled this new time where we have these eclipses in Cancer and Capricorn. in 2020, this is why I mentioned this, this eclipse series that began in 2018 will come to an end. We have the last of the Capricorn and Cancer eclipses in June and July of 2020. So this is just, I'm not going to go super into this because it would take forever, but for those who are, like I said, more plugged into the minutiae of astrology, we have a solar eclipse at 0 degrees of Cancer on June 21st. These times are in Eastern, so I know that some of you are in Australia, some of you are in Europe. It's happening at 0 Cancer. 0 Cancer is a solstice point. It's, you know, it's the first day of summer here in the Northern Hemisphere. It's the first day of winter in the Southern Hemisphere. There's a potency, there's a sense of new beginnings, new times. You know, the irony is like it's the last of the Cancer eclipses, but it's right on this point in astrology that talks about new beginnings. So wherever Cancer is in our chart, that part of our life is getting a powerful new beginning. And I think that it's that last reminder that it's just so important that we are getting our emotional needs met. And I know that might sound a little trivial or trite, but it's really important. When we're not fed in life, then life has no substance, it has no meaning, it has, you know, we kind of feel a little dead. You know, think about the opposite sign of Capricorn. It's here in the Northern Hemisphere, and certainly astrology is very Northern Hemisphere biased. It's winter, there's no life. So we need life, we need softness, we need sweetness, we need the kind of archetypical mother, you know, and if real mother was neither of these things, then how do we get that on a very new level? So 2 weeks later, we have a lunar eclipse at 13 Capricorn on July 5th of 2020. And this is the last in the series. This lunar eclipse, you know, we had a solar eclipse in Capricorn at pretty much the same degree. I think it might have been 15 of Capricorn on January 5th. So this is sort of like bringing to a close a story that began in January of 2019. And since it's the last of the last, you know, and Pluto is still in Capricorn, but Saturn is at the very, I mean, if you look at this chart, if you can see it, it's at the very last degree of Capricorn. Saturn's at 29 Capricorn for this eclipse. And I think there's this like, hey, what did you learn with this eclipse? The way that I see the 29th degree of any sign, there's a bit of a pressure on it to sort of demonstrate some maturity, some responsibility, and a sense of wisdom of knowing what that sign means. And what does it mean to do positive Capricorn? Set healthy boundaries, to have responsibilities, to have a sense of ambition and goals and feel like you're working towards something in the future. So, you know, I think it's really going to bring a little bit of a bump in this Saturn-Pluto energy that we've been experiencing or will experience throughout 2020. So all those things I was talking about when we were talking about Saturn and Pluto, I think they sort of like come up again, you know, on the flip side of, let's say, negative Saturn, looking at these fears, looking at what imprisons us, looking at what holds us back. And I think that the way that I have felt this energy, and I think I talked about this on my Facebook Live yesterday, is that if we're sort of living our life this wide, how do we open up even wider? If our, let's say, our capacity to let people in or to love is this big, how do we do that anymore? If our ambitions are this big, how do we do that even wider? So as I was saying, we're bringing to a close a story that began in the summer of 2018 with that round of eclipses, and then that second round of eclipses in January of 2019. So as I have been saying, Saturn's going to change signs in 2020. And what this means for each and every one of you is that a part of your life is going to start to demand more attention. Saturn, like a hand on the clock, is going to start to point towards Aquarius. And it will start to do so on March 21st, 2020. Incidentally, that's the first day of spring here in the Northern Hemisphere, the first day of autumn in the Southern Hemisphere. Saturn, when it enters the sign, we get this little preview. It's saying that, sorry, I'm going ahead, that the next few years, this part of our life is going to need much more attention. And I always, Saturn, because it has such a slow orbit, it takes 29 years to go around the zodiac. The last time it was in Aquarius was 1991 to 1993/1994. Depending on what age you are, whether you were born at that time in 1991 to 1994, or if you were born in 1963, 1964, 1965, if I'm doing my math correctly, you're going to be going through something called the Saturn return. This is just side note. So if you are coming up on age 29 or coming up on age 58 in the next year or two, 2020 is probably going to be a pivotal year because it's opening you up to the time of the Saturn return. Saturn return is checking in on your maturity, your development, your relationship with time, authority, being the authority, knowing what you want to be when you grow up. Incidentally, when Saturn was in Aquarius, it was a little fun fact. It was in Aquarius in 1963, 1964. That was some of the height of the civil rights movement, especially here in the United States. And I think that highlights kind of at the core, or some of these core themes of Saturn Aquarius, which is really about social justice, social equity, how do we interact and connect with each other. But Saturn in Aquarius also speaks to community science and technology. When Saturn was last in Saturn was last in Aquarius in the start of the 1990s, it was the birth of the internet. You could argue that the birth of the internet was actually during Saturn and Capricorn, but it was really in that early 90s period that this new thing called the net and the web became part of the everyday lexicon. I mean, it really took some time to become more integrated into everybody's lives, but that early 1990 period, it was like this kind of explosion of technology. Uranus was also in Aquarius at that time, a little side note. So the next, so from March until July 1st, we're going to get this 3-month preview. And Saturn is saying, okay, time to look at this part of your life, get ready, because I'm coming back in December 2020, and I'm going to make sure that you really work on this part of your life. And as I was saying, Saturn leaves Aquarius on July 1st. It will go back into Capricorn, and we will go back to work on our Saturn and Capricorn lessons, really integrating what we've learned, especially with Pluto in Capricorn as well. The eclipses are going to start to change signs in 2020. They're going to start to point towards Gemini and Sagittarius. So with the South Node going into Sagittarius, this is happening, I think, around March. We have to look at the past, our past relationship with Sagittarius. What does that look like? Sagittarius is beliefs and philosophy and truth and religion and knowledge and wisdom and adventure. It's the impulse and desire to travel and to explore and to see things from a different perspective. But then there's a shadow side of Sagittarius, and that's the fundamentalism. That's this idea that my truth is the only truth. So we have to sort of look at where we get stuck in old beliefs, in sort of this rigid thinking that you know, oh, it can only be this way, or this is the only truth. And we're starting to move towards Gemini, and Gemini is about new perspectives. It's about new ideas. It's about, hey, maybe I'm wrong. Let me look this up and get some new information, some new ideas. The first in the series of eclipses is in June. So yes, if you were paying attention, those Cancer Capricorn eclipses, the Cancer eclipse is on the 21st of June, the Capricorn eclipse is on the 5th of July, but before that, we have the first eclipse in this series, and this is on June 5th of 2020. At least it's here in East Coast time. I think that it's important to pay attention to this eclipse because it's the first in the series, just like that one back in July of 2018 was the first in the series. It sort of sets a tone. It sort of sends us in a new direction. And so we're going to maybe feel around the middle of this year that we're sort of maybe straddling worlds. The analogy that I use for eclipses is that it's like we're watching a theatrical performance, except it's our life. And the curtain is coming down, the stagehands are prepping and changing the scene, and we're getting ready for a new act. Well, the story is changing much more now that the eclipses are going into Sagittarius and Gemini. So as I was saying, like these eclipses, like we are dealing with the karma of belief and the karma of rigid thinking. This eclipse in particular, it does make a square to Neptune. So Neptune and Pisces, I think that there's an element of spirituality to all this, an element of existential searching and existential longing. The shadow side, of course, is when we sort of get our truths, our beliefs muddled and clouded. You know, how do we kind of look through our own illusions and look through these bigger illusions? And then that was the first in the series, and then 6 months after we have eclipse season in June and July, we're going to have another eclipse season from November until December 2020. So these eclipses will be firmly in Gemini and Sagittarius. So the one that's on November 30th, 2020 is at 8 Gemini, and it's the first of the Gemini eclipses. You know, this eclipse, it kind of plays into these themes around Neptune and, you know, with Mercury and Scorpio in this chart. I think that we're entering a time where information is very powerful, and we also have to like investigate and look for hidden truths. I mean, Mercury and Scorpio is such the investigation. And I will also add that Gemini is the sign of choice, at least the way that I see Gemini, the way that I've been taught Gemini. So I think that there's an element of really having to look at and weigh our choices as we go into 2020 and 2021, even 2022. 2 weeks later, after the eclipse, the lunar eclipse, we have the Sagittarius solar eclipse on December 14th, 2020. And again, it's really speaking to these deeper themes around belief and, you know, what sort of beliefs that we're a part of and the structures of belief. And Jupiter, the ruler of this eclipse, is like right coming up to the end of Capricorn. I think that there's a need to really cultivate a lot of wisdom in 2020 and really doing our research, really being accountable for what we believe in and accountable for our truths and how we communicate. I think these are all going to be big themes with these eclipses in 2020. I'm going to just check the chat for a question. The question from Danielle. So Danielle is asking about eclipses to outer planets. Yes, like everybody kind of has the outer planet at this approximately the same degree. You know, I'm a Pluto and Libra generation, so these eclipses in Cancer and Capricorn are squaring my Pluto and Libra, but they're squaring the Pluto and Libra for pretty much everybody who's born in the 1970s and maybe even the early 1980s, like me. So yes, there is that kind of generational aspect, but we have Pluto. This is slightly a tangent. Uranus, Neptune, Pluto they talk about a need for some sort of evolution, some sort of transformation of awareness, a transformation of consciousness. Each of those planets, they do that in their own way. Pluto does evolution of consciousness through the looking at the shadow. Neptune does evolution of consciousness through the dissolving of the boundaries between this world and the world that we can't see. Uranus does it through these breakthroughs, these awakenings, and sometimes these chaos, the things that really shake us out of, and the things that have previously imprisoned us. So yes, these eclipses are going to aspect different outer planets, but they're going to bring these evolutionary themes forward. So if your Pluto is aspected, or if the Pluto in the chart of the eclipse is aspected, it's going to really speak to these deeper shadow themes, whether for everybody or for you personally. Hopefully that answers your question. If it doesn't, Danielle, please let me know. Yeah, Venus and Mars are going to be retrograde in 2020. So Venus and Mars are personal planets, and when a personal planet goes retrograde, so let's say your Mercury, your Venus, your Mars, we're dealing with something that's more on a mundane level, as opposed to the outer planets, Jupiter turning retrograde, Saturn turning retrograde, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, etc. Because those planets, they will spend 5 months of the year retrograde. So when Saturn turns retrograde, Neptune turns it's no big deal, because they were spending pretty much half the year retrograde. When a personal planet turns retrograde, now I'm not to say it's like a big deal. I'm not the type of astrologer that gets worked up over Mercury retrograde. It's a thing, but it's not the end of the world thing. Nevertheless, when a planet turns retrograde, we have to review something. We have to integrate some sort of lesson into our consciousness. We need to try on these new ideas and these new truths. And so because it's Venus and Mars in 2020, there is an element of that. We are doing work on relationships this year, because Venus and Mars are the relationship planets. And so they're also, Venus being this planet that speaks to value, we're also looking at values in 2020, the worth of things, the worth of ourselves, the worth of a relationship. And then because Mars is retrograde as well, not at the same time, thankfully, we're also looking at these bigger themes around courage and leadership, because Mars, like positive Mars, really inspires us to take action and to go forward and to lead. But then we have to sort of turn it all around and look at the other side with Mars retrograde. How do we not have courage? How do we not initiate? And even how are we using our Mars? And Mars is also aggression. And sometimes we use too much Mars or not enough Mars. So from Venus, Venus turns retrograde every 18 months. So we last had a Venus retrograde in October of November of 2018. So just worth, let's say, on your own time, thinking back what was going on during that time. It was in Scorpio, by the way. So we're doing a lot of deep interpersonal shadow work around relationships and power and intimacy and sexuality. But Venus will be in Gemini. It'll be retrograde in Gemini from May until June. I quite like Venus in Gemini. It's just like a personal thing, but there is this, Venus is Gemini is like the social butterfly, but the analogy that I often use for Venus in Gemini is it likes to fill up on candy and not the real meal. So Venus in Gemini, gets really kind of like, oh, tries all the things, but then it's like, kind of, doesn't really commit to anything. I think with so much Saturn energy in the chart this year, we need to kind of look at where we're not committing in our relationships, where we're not fully taking the time to cultivate something and to value something. Venus or Gemini also talks about choice. So there's an element of having to look at our relationship choices in May and June. So the other planet that's turning retrograde, these two major interplanet retrogrades, is Mars. And Mars turns retrograde every 2 years. And the last time Mars was retrograde was from June until August of 2018. This year, 2020, Mars turns retrograde from September 9th until November 13th, 2020. It's doing it in Aries, and Mars goes into Aries, by the way, on the 27th of June of 2020. It does not leave Aries until I think it's January 6th of 2021. Yes, we are having 6 months of Mars in Aries. Maybe this means nothing to you, but what I'm trying to impart, Mars is very strong in Aries. Mars in Aries, in its highest expression, is the warrior. It's the leader. It's somebody that has all this power and fire and puts it towards something. On the other side, Mars in Aries can be very hot-headed and impetuous, and it can also speak to aggression. And so I think that when Mars is retrograde, we have to take a look at, on a personal level and a collective level, how we're using our Mars. And if we totally run over people, or we totally don't do the Venus side. Like Venus is like, hey, what do you want? Mars is like, I want this. Like that's the dynamic of those two planets. They both are important. Neither one is better or less than the other. So I think that it's important to note that things might get a little wild the second half of 2020, because there's a part of our chart, wherever Aries is, it's going to kind of like ignite, and hopefully in the best possible way. But Mars will turn retrograde in September. So we might, when Mars goes into Aries at the end of June of this year, we might be really ready to rush forward on something. But then Mars kind of slows down, turns retrograde, and then we have to take time to work something out. And then it might not be till the end of 2020 when we fully get that resolution, depending on where Aries is in our chart. I'm just going to go to the questions in the chat. There's comments about Venus and Gemini. It's a fun sign. It's like flirty. It likes to schmooze and socialize, but it's like this little butterfly. It just goes from like thing to thing to thing to thing to thing. And then meanwhile, Saturn's in Capricorn and Pluto's in Capricorn, and it's like, settle down. Like, what are you doing? Anyway, I like, Gemini is my 7th house, so whatever. Let's do a sign by sign look. So I've been giving you that bigger overview for this year. And now what does it mean for each sign? Aries and Aries rising, and just as a side note for everybody, as the question that I get often, which is better, or it's not which is better, which is correct, the rising sign or the sun sign. At this point in my career, at this point of doing all the consultations that I've done in my professional career, they're both correct. Time is not quite linear. Time is these really complex overlaying matrix of things happening, and you'll find that there are these kind of two times in your life that are running parallel to each other, and sometimes they contradict and sometimes they intersect. The only time that you don't have two times in your life is if you were born at sunrise. That's a side note. So if you are an Aries or an Aries rising, 2020, and this is carrying over a lot of themes from 2019 and 2018. It's so much a time in your life that's about answering this fundamental question. What do you want to do when you grow up? It doesn't matter if you are 25 or 65. You've got Saturn right high up in your chart in Capricorn and your career sign of Capricorn. So you're continuing the story in 2020 about restructuring, about maybe new job opportunities, new taking the next step up in your career. But if you look back and look at the life that you've lived since 2008 and what has been happening in your career since 2008, you might see some, let's say, night and day, like, wow, you have come so far, and things have, so many things have happened in the last 12 years. So I think Aries is really important for you to understand that Saturn, as it gets to the end of Capricorn in March, and you get that report card, Saturn's like, how have you been doing with figuring out what you want to do professionally, or the direction you want to take your life in? Because sometimes I get some feedback and people are like, well, it's not quite career for me. And that part of the chart is like the steering wheels, it's technical point, like the first house and the 10th house, they're very young, they're very self-directive and active. And you need to make sure you're steering the ship of your life in the direction that you need to go. But at the same time, maybe Aries, you've needed to really pull down and tear down these old ambitions, these old structures, these old ways of doing career and direction that don't quite fit you anymore. So I think that Saturn's really going to continue to pressure you to commit, to take responsibility, to work hard. Of course, every Aries listening, this is going to happen in its own way. And so these eclipses that are rounding out in Capricorn, you might see some natural times in your professional life where there's a change in job. Maybe there's a promotion. That's my hope for you, Aries or Aries rising. I will say, Aries, this is a time to really utilize, 2020. Don't let this pass you by. If you have ambitions and goals, really work towards them this year, because you have Saturn really helping you to go higher in your professional life or go higher in your ambitions. With the eclipses happening in the bottom of your chart in Cancer, Cancer forms the base and the foundation, you might be seeing a move in 2020. So a move either at the beginning of 2020 or move in the middle, approximately. This might be, depending on what your chart is. A change in the home, perhaps. This, if it's not a move, like what, something about your living situation might change. Also, maybe a need to get your needs met. Maybe it's a time when you really need to get down to your roots. And then that said, maybe you're seeing some themes and some issues with your own family or family in general. With Saturn going into what's called your 11th house, Aries, that little 3-month preview that I was talking about, friendships and community are going to start to become an increased focus for you. Sometimes when Saturn goes into this part of your chart, and I'm just this is like a gentle warning, the friendships that aren't really supporting us anymore, the friendships that are not going to last, they sometimes will leave when Saturn goes into what's called the 11th house. So, you might be weeding out friendships, maybe friendships might be weeding themselves out, but nevertheless, you're going to be entering a time when you really need to build stronger social connections, stronger community, and even stronger friendships. Um, because Mars is your ruling planet, Mars is going to be in Aries for 6 months. So you're going to have Mars in your sign for 6 months. And so it's just like, look out. You're going to feel like you are on fire, and for good and maybe not so good. So really be careful about impulse, be careful around being hot-headed or overly aggressive, especially as Mars starts to turn retrograde, because you might have to deal with something like kind of an old theme, an old karmic theme around anger and aggression, and really starting to work to how do you work towards that positive Mars in 2020, with the eclipses starting to switch signs and getting out of what's called your 10th and your 4th houses, career and home. You're going to start to open up to a time that's about education and maybe even travel or foreign travel. With the North Node going into Gemini, it might be a time when you're really having to open up to new ideas, new ways of thinking, new information. You might be taking a lot more classes in 2020 and even 2021. Going back to school, that might be something that's maybe on the horizon for you, Aries. And I will also add, this is not in this, because Venus is your career sign, not career sign, sorry, because Venus is your relationship planet, that retrograde from May until June might, you might need to work out some old relationship themes around them. I included I'm not going to go super into the minutia of this, because it will take 5 years to do all the signs. But these are kind of these major months for you. So, because the eclipse has been happening, January is a big time for you with the eclipses. Mars, Mars is your ruling planet. So it's in the beginning of the year, it's really focused on travel and education. It's going to move into your career sign from February until March, February 16th. When Mars goes into Capricorn on February 16th, it's going to really make you busy. From February to March is also going to activate a lot of this eclipse energy. So March and February, it might be the time when you're really seeing these things that I was saying about maybe career changes, career shifts. Saturn changes sign in March until July. And then I think it's, like I said, Mars goes into what's called your 12th house from May until June. Really rest up from May until June, because you're going to have Mars running super hot in your first house that second half from June 27th until the beginning of 2021. So you just might feel a little lower energy in May to June, and then that Mars retrograde is from September to November. And then, Saturn will go back, by the way, to your 10th house starting on July 1st. So, whatever sort of career initiatives and responsibilities and direction, you'll need to go back and revisit that and reintegrate and tie up loose ends and hopefully put a nice little pretty bow on that part of your life. Let me just take some questions from the chat. Taryn, that's a good question. So Taryn's asking, should we look at the sign after our rising as well, if you're born late in the sign? I think for simplicity, just focus on the sign. If you, trying to think of a quick example, if you know like where your ascendant is and you feel that it's like a first house versus 12th house situation, I mean, maybe see what the next sign or the previous sign says, and you might get some information, but just to kind of make things super simple for everybody, I'm just going to look at whole signs right now, but that's a good question. And Kara is really excited about Mars and Aries. I don't know if I'm excited. I'm a Scorpio, so I'm Mars ruled, and I'm just like, oh man, what is Mars and Aries? What is that going to be like for 6 months? And then Mars gets into Taurus on January 6th of 2021, and I think we'll just be so tuckered out that we'll just want to just lay on the floor, lay on the couch, sleep in, eat a lot of snacks. That's what Mars and Taurus likes to do. Likes to do some other things, but it's a PG rated webinar. So Danielle asked, what kind of orb do I use? Danielle, I'm mostly looking at the squares in general, just to kind of create a narrative, because the squares talk about manifestation. You know, you really see the squares before you see the trines and the sextiles. But if we're just talking about aspects in general, I generally use a 10-degree orb for squares and conjunctions. Sextiles, 3-4 degrees, 5 if I'm feeling crazy. Trines, you know, between like, 5 and 10. And then I do have some exceptions. I will use wider orbs if we're talking about outer planets to Sun and the Moon or other major planets in the chart, because outer planets like a Pluto conjunction and it's 11 degrees, it's conjunct, even though it's like super, yeah, the same for the oppositions. Opposition I use 10 degree orbs, except if it's an outer planet, I will sometimes go wider. You know, sometimes when, not to go too off tangent here, if I'm looking at a chart and I'm just seeing a narrative and I'm seeing planets that aren't quite conjunct or not quite opposite, they're 15 degrees, but they're really plugging into the narrative, I count them. Maybe it's a little bit, not as forward, but that's just me. Every astrologer is different, and if you want to see astrologers nearly come to fisticuffs, to blows, start asking them about what houses they use and what orbs they use. Anyway, just everybody just do your own thing, whatever works for you. This is what works for me. So Taurus and Taurus rising. So, Taurus, you've been in kind of an interesting time in your life because you've had Uranus in your sign since March of 2019. And if you've been paying attention to some of the things that I've been writing, or even saying in previous webinars, you are in a time of reinvention. So Taurus, it's a time for you to really open up your eyes to new ways of being. I think Taurus, this was with love, you need to get out of your way. So really use 2020 to get out of your way, because otherwise you're just going to be blocking whatever needs to, the good things that need to happen. And a lot of this Saturn-Pluto business is happening in a part of your chart that talks about breaking down negative beliefs. And so Taurus, if you've got the blinders on and you're not able to see with a wider vision, like how do you really truly open up your eyes in 2020? So yeah, it's a year of personal reinvention. You may also be having let's say some big trips, some big travel, anything that really educates you in a new way and opens you up to the world, in a new way of the world. And then Saturn's going to get to your career sign of Aquarius forgot when that's going to happen, from March until July. So that's your preview. Saturn is saying to you, hey, Taurus, get ready, because when I get back to Aquarius in the end of December, we're going to spend the next couple of years really answering this question. What do you want to do when you grow up? So the next few years for you, Taurus, might be a time of career advancement, career milestones, or career restructuring as you realize that you need to kind of get on a new path. And I think with like Venus turning retrograde, no big deal. I know it's your ruling planet from May until June. I think because Gemini is your money sign, you just need to take a look at what you really truly value. And then with the eclipses, you know, with Mars going into what's called your 12th house for the second half of the year, it's going to be a very, let's say, soul-searching, existential, meditative, because Mars in what called the 12th house, like you can't do Mars in the real world. You can't like go for, it's like you have to put Mars to some sort of spiritual action, because the 12th house is very spiritual. So meditation, mysticism, spirituality, that might be a big theme for you in the second half of the year. And also letting go of baggage. You know, like I said, Taurus, you're in a time of reinvention. What do you need to let go of? And you're the sign that likes to accumulate things. That's what you do. I have this friend who's a Taurus, and she's kind of that typical Taurus that kind of is a little bit of a pack rat and holds on to things from the past. And she's just been like putting things for sale on Facebook just to get rid of all the stuff that she's accumulated. So I don't know, I'm just putting that out there in case you're a Taurus and you resonate with that. Taurus and Taurus rising, these are kind of your key dates. So I'll quickly go through them. Uranus is turning direct on January 10th in what's called your first house. So January might be a bit of an electrifying month for you. I mean that in the best possible way. Uranus is trying to kind of shake you awake. It's trying to get you out of a rut. It's trying to open you up to freedom and new ways of being. If we were to fast forward Taurus to, say, 6 years from now, when Uranus gets to the very end of Taurus, you may look very different. You may physically look different. You may express yourself differently, but nevertheless, you are going through a time of personal reinvention, and you may feel very inspired in January to do whatever that, or to make that reinvention happen. In January, Mars is going to, Mars kind of left your relationship sign of Scorpio at the very beginning of January. So it's going to spend the first, let's say, month or so, 6 weeks in your 8th house. So doing a lot of, let's say, deep work around your psyche and intimacy and vulnerability and sexuality. And Mars then in February moves to what's called your 9th house. So from February to March, you may be traveling more. You may be going to another country or going like on a long distance trip. It's also a time when education might be very highlighted for you as well, Taurus. By March, Mars goes into what's called your 10th house. So from March until May, you might be working very hard. You might be very career focused. Mars is going to be in Aquarius, which is your career sign. And it might even like propel you in new directions because you've been doing all this personal reinvention, and now you want to take action on this personal reinvention. Because Saturn will get to the end of Capricorn in March, and you're going to get that report card, by the way, and Saturn's going to ask you, like, how are you doing, and really redefining what you believe in, how you see the world, how do you see yourself in the world, how are you shaking up old thinking and even negative patterns around thinking and belief. And then it gets into your 10th house in in March, and you're going to get that little preview. And then Venus, like I said, is in retrograde from May until June. It's going to do that in your 2nd house of values and money. Mars will go into, Mars will go into your sign of groups and friendships and community from May until June. So that might be a time when you're feeling really like you want to connect with people, you want to build relationships with other people, spend time with friends. And then Mars goes into that 12th house in June. So you're doing that really deep work. The eclipses start to shift into your 3rd and your 9th in June, and end of the eclipses in your 3rd and 9th. So you really kind of wrapping up this time of education and travel and kind of really focusing on the mind and what you believe in. And then the eclipses are going to start to go into what's called your second and eighth. So for you, you're entering a new time that's really focused on these money themes: money, stability, security, what you need materially. And then, of course, on the other side of things, assets, finance, wealth, and even some of the deeper emotional stuff that happens with the eighth house: intimacy, vulnerability, letting people in. I do put the Uranus direct that happens in middle of August, so you might get that. Sorry, that should say Uranus retrograde. I'll fix that when I send the slides. Uranus turns retrograde in August, so that's kind of continuing the story of personal reinvention. And then Mars retrograde from September to November. And then by the end of the year, Saturn will go into Aquarius on December 17th. So the very end of the year, just in time for the holiday season, you're going to start to focus on this new time in your life. Gemini and Gemini rising. I've been talking about this in my horoscopes and in my different videos, and I think Gemini has had a little bit of a rough go of it the past couple of years. That's because Saturn's been in your eighth house. So this has been, since the beginning of 2018, a time when you've had to do a lot of emotional heavy lifting. This means searching the psyche, looking at what you've been holding on to, old traumas, the past, vulnerability, intimacy. So it's been a heavy time, and I think the good news for you, Gemini, is that you're going to start to come out of this heavy emotional time in 2020. The whole idea, and especially with Saturn and Pluto in Capricorn in what's called your eighth house, is to break down these really deep, deep, deep parts of yourself, deep parts of your psyche, the deep parts of your shadow. Again, the shadow is the part of you that's not on your team. It's working against you. So this idea that you might have, let's say, hopefully shined a lot of light in places that you wouldn't normally have shined a light on, because Gemini, in general, you're a sign that likes to kind of play it a little on the surface. There's nothing wrong with that, but this has just been the past 2 years about really cultivating deep depth in your life. And then when Saturn changes signs, it's going to start to point towards a part of your life that talks about travel, faith. What do you believe in? I mean, that's the thing about going through these heavy emotional times. It's meant to kind of get you to reflect back on yourself and see yourself differently, and then answer this kind of fundamental question, like, what's your truth now? Now that everything's been stripped away, like, what's your truth? And so with the eclipses starting to go into, they'll wrap up in what's called your second house. And so you're still trying to create more material stability in your life and really kind of hopefully do what you love in order to earn a living. I did put in the slide that 2020 and 2022 will be pivotal years. And that's because the eclipses are starting to go into Gemini and Sagittarius. When the eclipses line up with your sign, your life is at a crossroads, and it is going to be a time when relationship is more and more a major theme in your life, Gemini. So, starting in the beginning of the year, Mars is in what's called your relationship sign of Sagittarius. So Gemini, this might be a time when you're really having to interconnect with people. If you're in a relationship, maybe there's something going on. Mars is never kind of quiet. It kind of makes things happen, heats things up. If you're single and you want to be in a relationship, this is a time when maybe you're feeling very motivated to change that, to go out there, socialize, and connect with people, and meet new people. Mars then goes into what's called your eighth house from February to March. Because you've been doing this really deep emotional work, Mars is going to, let's say, ping off of those eclipse degrees. And so I just put this on your radar that, February and March just might it might hit some deep points emotionally, spiritually, psychically. Nothing to worry about, but I just wanted to put that on your radar. One of the things I've been communicating about Gemini, and would say in other spaces, I just think it's a really good time for Gemini to have a guide as they go through their personal underworld. They need somebody to hold their hand to kind of get them out of the darkness and back towards the light. So just make sure you're really taking care of your emotional and spiritual health in February and March. Mars then goes into your ninth house from March until May. You might be kind of thinking about these deeper existential questions, and also travel. Saturn changing signs from March until July is that your sign that you are going into a new time in your life. The eclipses are going to start to slip into your sign and also your relationship sign starting in June. So really pay attention to that June 5th lunar eclipse, because that's going to signal that you've entered a new time in relationships. So whatever stories and themes, like, they're going to thread their way into 2022. And then the eclipses are going to start to go from the they're going to wrap up in the 2nd and 8th house, this time when you've really had to do some deep examination and focus on these deeper themes around trust and security and stability. May to June with Mars in the 10th, you might be working very hard. Mars in the 10th tends to be a time when you feel very inspired and motivated to get out there in the world and to get your ambitions moving. Saturn, it will go back into your 8th house from July to December. So do keep in mind that you do have to wrap up some loose ends in the second half of the year. Mars also goes into your 11th house in July till December. So it's going to do that retrograde in the part of your chart that talks about friendships and community. So while you might be very social and meeting a lot of people, you will have to deal with the work of the retrograde from September until November. Jupiter, which is an important planet in your chart, it will change signs in December. So you might be a time when you might see some changes in career, you might see some changes in relationships. And then that's the same time that Saturn changes signs as well. Cancer and Cancer rising. Cancer, you have been in a little bit of a pickle, so to speak, the past couple of years, because you've been dealing with these eclipses at the same time. You've been dealing with Saturn at the same time. You've been dealing with Pluto. So this idea that you've been doing a lot of work on relationships. And I think when Saturn gets to the end of Capricorn in March, that's your report card. And if you have met somebody and it's something serious, then that report card, so to speak, it might be renewed commitment to this person. If you're in a relationship and it's under a lot of stress, you're going to have to make some decisions by March, and then maybe revisit them at the second half of the year when Saturn comes back. You're also releasing toxic emotional patterns and toxic relationship patterns. Really see where there is some toxicity in relationships. You'll know it when you see it. And how do you do what Saturn wants you to do, which is to say no, set healthy boundaries. You're going to be going into a time when Saturn goes into the 8th house, when you're going to have to do a lot of emotional transformation. All this work you've been doing in relationships has really set you up for the next big chapter of your life, and where you're really digging into these deeper themes around emotional intimacy and vulnerability, and maybe even themes around sexuality and power and control. With Mars at the top of your chart, the second half of the year, Mars, Aries is your career sign. Second half of the year is probably going to be very busy. If you want to change jobs, Mars is probably going to give you like a lot of fire to go out and make that happen. With the eclipses starting to slip out of your relationship sign, they're going to go into the part of your chart that talks about health. So the second part of the year, you need to really kind of look at your health, how you're taking care of your body, because that's going to be a theme into 2021. On the other side of things, you're entering a time with those eclipses in Gemini about shedding the past and letting go. So these are kind of your major dates for Cancer and Cancer rising. As we talk in January 2020, this is a big time for you, Cancer. Big time for relationships, big time for you, new beginnings, crossroads. When Mars goes into Capricorn in February and March, it's gonna really ignite some of these things that have been simmering and what you've been dealing with relationships. So I only say this if you've been having some relationship agita. Mars is going to activate those eclipse degrees, and you're going to have to make some decisions about the people who are in your life. Saturn will switch signs from March until July. Again, you're entering a time that's about deeper emotional work. Just make friends with a Gemini and ask them about the past few years. Then the eclipses are going to start to switch signs. As I said, health and wellness is going to be an increasing, both physical health and spiritual health is going to be an increased focus as you go into the rest of 2020. Mars is going to be, go into the part of your chart that talks about travel, education from May until June. You might be doing some travel at that time. And then you're going to have that big Mars in your 10th house from June until December. Saturn does go back into your 7th in July 1st. So if there's some unfinished business with relationships, you're going to have to tidy up that mess, or to make your commitments, or to, undo some vows and commitments in the second half of the year. Then Saturn changes signs on December 17th, and Jupiter also changes signs in December, going into Aquarius, also your 8th house. Leo and Leo rising. Leo, you've been in kind of an interesting place. You're a year into a 7-year story of reinventing career, reinventing your direction in life. So that's going to continue. Every Leo is living this differently. It just may mean that 6 years from now, if we were to fast forward, you're doing something very different than you're doing now, or you've transformed it, or it's opened up, or it's taken off. Uranus really wants there to be authenticity in what you're doing professionally. And this is just an example, if you are a lawyer because that's what you're supposed to do, because that's what your parents did, that's what your grandparents did, here comes Uranus, and Uranus is like, what do you really want to do? Because this is not it. So that's where you might see some of the more dramatic shifts. And then you're going to get that report card on the work that you've been doing with health and wellness and taking care of your body. Saturn rules over in Capricorn as teeth and bones. So just make sure you're getting your calcium, you're lifting weights, you're taking your vitamins, you're getting nice and clean and organized, because Saturn is kind of checking over this part of your life. This also includes, if this is relevant to you, this is a wonderful time to let go of addictions. With the eclipses also in your 12th house, it's a great time for any sort of rehab. So use that information wisely if that's relevant to you, because Saturn is the planet of no. And if you are doing things on a health level, on a physical level, that Saturn is not happy with, Saturn's like, no, stop. So you really do have a chance to break some addictions at this time. You're also shedding the past. You're letting go of old memories and old emotions and old family energy. And then with the eclipse is starting to go into, actually, I think that's Mars. With Mars going into, to do my quick math, Mars is going to be in Aries for that second half of the year, and that part of your life talks about travel. So you might be traveling a lot in the second half of 2020. And then the eclipses are going into the part of your chart that talks about identity, creativity, the self, how you are really honoring your talents, and you're also going to be opening up to new friendships, new community, and being out there in the world. Uranus, I mentioned, Uranus turning direct in January because it's part of this ongoing story for you, Leo, about reinventing your career. So really be mindful of the conversations that you're having, the experiences, the opportunities, and even the thoughts that you're having, because it's part of this bigger story of transforming your professional life and transforming your ambitions and even your direction in life. These eclipses that are happening in January, they do speak to physical and spiritual health. Mars is going to go into Capricorn from February until March. I think Mars really wants you to take action with these healthy initiatives, these hopefully healthy initiatives that you've been setting for yourself for the new year. By March, Mars goes into your relationship sign. So you might be dealing with some relationship things from March until May. Maybe you are getting a new relationship. Maybe you're meeting new people. Maybe you're having to deal with something with a current partner. And then from May until June, Mars goes into what's called the 8th house. So May to June, you're going to be doing some deeper emotional lifting, kind of getting into this themes around intimacy, vulnerability, sexuality, connection, and this deeper psychological work. The retrograde, or Mars in Aries is going to be in the part of your chart that talks about higher education, travel, philosophy, getting your point across, having a point, having an opinion. And that's going to be, you're going to have a lot of opinions, Leo, from June until December. And then the eclipses, they are going into what's called the 11th and the 5th houses. So, like I said, from June until December, you're opening up to this new time that's about social connection, community, and maybe even like these bigger societal themes, politics. And then kind of finishing up this story about health and wellness. Uranus does turn retrograde in August, so that's your other check-in with this story of professional reinvention. And then, do keep in mind that Saturn will go into the 7th house from March until July. So by the way, Leo, you're entering a time where a relationship, an even serious relationship, is going to be a key theme going into 2021 and 2022. So when it goes, it's going to retrograde out, it's going to go back in December, and that's really your new time. Just checking on the chat. I'm sorry, I have to kind of read this. Very much about 6th house stuff for me. We're kind of having a conversation here, Taryn, about whole sign versus Placidus, for example. If it's crossing and it's going into the 6th house, but let's say it's still in Capricorn, you know what I mean? Like, look at both. Maybe you see more of the 6th house themes, but look at both, because I use both whole sign and Placidus. And so for me, for instance, I have 22 Sagittarius rising. So, Mars right now is in Sagittarius, whole sign, that's a 1st house transit, but it's definitely a 12th house transit because, my 12th house begins at 4 Sagittarius. So these are these little kind of, personal nuances of your own chart. You're going to get these overlapping bits of information. It's like, is it a 7th house transit? Is it a 6th house transit? It's both, but just see what sort of narrative sort of rises to the top if that makes sense. Virgo and Virgo rising. Virgo, you've been in an interesting time. I think that there's been this deeper story where you need to really transform yourself. And I think that means getting out of your own way, kind of like what I've been saying to Taurus, your fellow earth sign, really breaking down these old patterns around self and identity, because this Saturn-Pluto conjunction is happening in the part of your chart that talks about the self, talks about how you express who you are, it's how you create, and maybe where you kind of get in the way of that. So Virgo, sometimes you put other people first before you put yourself, and maybe how are you changing that in 2020? And so you're going to get your little report card on how are you taking yourself seriously, how are you taking your talents seriously. Sometimes Virgo, you can be a bit self-effacing and maybe not value as much some of the things that you do or the things that make you you. And Saturn's really saying, no, these things are valuable, you're valuable. And so that's kind of where your report card's going to be. The eclipses in Cancer have been in the part of your chart that talks about friendships and community, and that's what you really need right now. You need people. Yes, the narrative will start to shift in 2020 for you, but really make sure that you have built and fed and connected with the people that are really going to feed your life right now. Saturn will switch signs in March, and it will go into the part of your chart that talks about health and wellness. So you're going to get that little preview on this new time in your life where you need to really focus on your physical body, focus on how you're taking care of your body. And yes, Virgo is a sign that talks about health and wellness in general. So in a way, this should be right up your alley. It's kind of where you're going to go a little bit deeper into yourself and on this part of your life. Mars is going to be in Aries, which is the part of your chart that talks about the psyche, your emotional health, getting into these nooks and crannies of the deepest parts of yourself. So you're going to be doing a lot of emotional digging and emotional work in the second half of 2020. And, with all this personal transformation you're doing, like what are those kind of, let's say, those proverbial demons that are still kind of lurking in your, in your psyche. You're also really trying to open up how you see the world. So really be open, Virgo, to new ways of thinking and new ways of being. These kind of personal lightning bolts, these epiphanies that really do transform your life. Mars is going to be in the part of your chart that talks about home and family from January to February. So this might be a time when you're naturally really staying at home, focusing at home, spending time with family, or maybe even possibly moving. I will say Mars in this part of your chart is not, it's a bit noisy. So maybe the home environment is a bit noisy as well. Mars does change signs in February. It goes into your 5th house, which is going to really activate these themes around identity, creativity, talents, taking yourself seriously. What is this old persona that you have that needs to come down in order to, build something new? And then by March, Mars goes into your 6th. That's when you're doing a lot of that kind of classic Virgo work, cleaning, organizing, projects, work, getting focused, getting diligent, because here comes Saturn. Saturn is really taking a look at things. And yes, I know that there are messy Virgos. Not every Virgo is a pristine, clean, vision of life. And so Saturn's going to be taking a look at your fridge, your cabinets, your schedule, your home, your organization, for the next, for that 3-month preview. And then it dips back out in July, and it wraps up that story about the self and persona into December. That said, Mars is going to spend a long time in the 8th house, so you're doing a lot of deep emotional and psychic work in that. And you may also be extra intuitive because the 8th house can sometimes be very, let's say, mediumistic. The eclipses are going to start to go in your 10th and your 4th house. And this is important to note because Virgo, you're entering a 2-year period where you might be moving. You might be seeing your life go in a different direction. You might be at crossroads. There might be some professional changes in career in the second half of 2020. So pay attention to that June 5th lunar eclipse, because it's going to give you some material to work with that's going to maybe give you some deeper insight of what this new time that's opening up for you. Mars will turn retrograde from September to November. I think that's the time when maybe some of that deeper emotional stuff is going to come up. Virgo, you might be a good candidate for working with a counselor, a guide, a therapist maybe, to kind of get into that deeper material. And then Jupiter, one of your important planets, does change signs in December. So you might start to see some changes in direction in December, and especially in home, and especially in relationship. Just check in on the chat. Thank you. Yes. So, sorry, went ahead. So Libra and Libra rising, this is the part of your chart. You're coming into part of your life that talks about breaking down these really old emotional patterns and structures, and that's where that Saturn-Pluto energy, it's in your 4th house right now. So really release and purge, and if there's old family, old ancestral stuff, continue to really dig into that and let that go in 2020. That said, as you're doing a lot of psychic excavation this year, you are putting down new roots, a new foundation. Libra, you might be moving in 2020. Maybe you already have moved. Maybe you are getting a new home. Saturn, it's going to get to the end of Capricorn in March. You're going to get that little report card on how you're doing home and family in your life. Sometimes when Saturn is in this part of the chart, you do see the birth of a child. There's a change in the home, literally, because there's a new child in the home. And then it's going to give you that preview on a part of your chart that talks about identity, creativity, self, taking yourself seriously, taking your talents seriously. You can talk to a Virgo and get some notes, because that's what they're coming out of right now. So that's going to give you your little preview. Then Saturn gets back to Capricorn in July. And so you're wrapping up that chapter about settling down, planting down roots, home and family in the second half of 2020. With Mars is going to go into your relationship sign for 6 months. That's a long time. So Libra, relationships and other people are going to be a huge part of your 2020. If you are in partnership, there just might be a lot of things going on with your partner. There might be a lot of things going on in your relationship, and you're having to negotiate, Mars and Mars retrograde, and what does your partner want? What do you want? How do you negotiate? And how do you, work? Because Mars is going to, let's say, more empower your partner. And so you might have to kind of do a little bit of a dance with your partner. If you're not in a relationship, even if you are in a relationship, Mars retrograde gives you an opportunity to really go back and look at some old emotional stuff. It's very classic when you have a retrograde in what's called the 7th house, that somebody from the past, or somebody even from a past life, shows back up. That gives you that chance to sort of work out some old stuff. So Libra and Libra rising, these are your key periods and dates, Saturn-Pluto conjunction, that's coming up. It's going to make January possibly a big month for you. These are major eclipses in what are called your 10th and your 4th. It's a time that's about new career opportunities, new career direction. So you might be seeing yourself go in new directions in 2020, and you might even be seeing some job opportunities, some job offers, or even change in status. I have a friend who's Libra rising, and she's pregnant with her first child. So this career transit for her is also a change in title. She's going to become a mother. So these are kind of different ways in which, these eclipses can speak to status and title, kind of the title that's after our name. Mars is going to be heating things up from February to March, and that part of the chart that talks about home and family and roots and foundation. So that's when you might see a move. That's when you might see a change in the home, a change in the living situation. Mars can be a bit noisy in that part of the chart, so it might not be the most peaceful and relaxing time for you in your home environment. When Mars and both Saturn, they're going to go into what's called your 5th house in March. So you're entering a time when you're really trying to think about these bigger questions about identity and creativity and the self. The eclipses are going to start to go into what's called your 9th and 3rd houses. So that's saying to you that as you go into the second half of this year and as you go into 2021, travel and education, communication, the mind, information, writing, learning are all going to be big themes for you. And you are wrapping up that story that began in 2018 as the eclipses come to an end in Cancer and Capricorn in June and July. From May until June, Mars will be in your sign of health and wellness. So that just might be a time when you are either really focusing on your physical health, doing all your checkups and whatnot, or maybe even working hard or working too much. Because sometimes when Mars goes into this part of our chart, we become a little bit of a workaholic. Your planet Venus is going to go retrograde from May until June. It's interesting. It's a time when you need to take a second look at what you believe in, what your truth is. And also you might be spending a lot of time traveling and exploring in 2020. Mars does go into your 7th house from June until December. That's that big long period that I told you about other people. And then Saturn returns to the 4th house from July until December, but then goes back into the 5th in December. And Jupiter also changes signs, it's not on here, in December. Scorpio rising, we're starting to get to that last stretch of signs in the zodiac. Thank you guys for being patient. Like I said, it's a lot of information to go through. And pause for a moment if you are watching the replay, and if you have questions, of course, you can send them to me via email. So Scorpio and Scorpio rising, with Uranus in your relationship sign of Taurus, this is an area that's going to continue to see a lot of change and transformation as you go into 2020 and beyond. So new people are coming into your life, people that might be very different than the old story. And also you're but Uranus is asking you, quite maybe forcefully, to interact and socialize and connect with people differently. That said, because Uranus is in your 7th, you're getting that opposition to your sun, Scorpio. So it's a time to really open up to new ways of self as well. All that Saturn-Pluto work, all that Capricorn stuff is happening in the part of your chart that talks about voice, communication. And if you've been using your voice like this big, then how do you open it up this big in 2020? Because Saturn's really going to give you that report card in March to let you know how you've been doing with learning, education, really exercising the mind, of course, exercising your voice. When Saturn changes signs in March, late March, it's going to go into what's called your 4th house. You're entering a big time, Scorpio. It's what's called an angular ingress. Anyway, so this few-month period is like you're going to be settling down. Like Saturn's asking you to put down roots, to settle down, to think about something serious with home and family, and that might even in a way talk about relationships as well. But really pay attention to what is happening in that 3-month preview, because it's going to be a thread that runs its way through 2021 and 2022. With Venus turning retrograde in from May until June, you're going to have to do some past work with relationships. Maybe old relationships come up. And do keep in mind that Mars, your planet, it's going to spend a long time in Aries, which is not just your sign of health and wellness, but it's also your sign of work and projects. So you're going to be very busy the second half of 2020. And if you have any sort of healthy initiatives, I would really, you might be having a lot of energy that needs to get out there. So giving Mars a focus the second half of 2020, going to the gym, going to yoga, going to whatever, going for a run, a walk, getting out, because Mars can't be pent up. And so you might kind of have to work through some of that stuff when Mars goes retrograde. So in January, Uranus turns direct on January 10th. This is the story about relationships that's continuing. Really pay attention to what's going on, because it's a thread that goes through the next few years. Your planet, it's in Sagittarius from January to February. And so it's about money and income and creating material stability and security for the first 5 weeks, 6 weeks of the year. By then, Mars moves to the 3rd house in February. So that, I think February to March is going to be very busy. You might be busy with things to do, places to go. It's also a time when information, communication, education are very highlighted for you. By March and then until May, you're going to need to slow down a little bit and spend some time at home, spend some time really kind of getting to your roots and your foundation, because here comes Saturn for that little 3-month preview. Mars does go into your 5th house from May until June. That's a time what's about having fun, romance, creativity, self-expression, pleasure, joy, and then it's good old Mars in the 6th forever for the second half of the year. So you're going to be doing a lot of work on your physical life and your physical being in the second half of 2020. The eclipses are going to start to go into the 8th and the 2nd Scorpio. So you are entering a time when it is about your money story, how you earn a living, how you create material stability in your life. And then, with eclipses going into your 8th house, you're going to be doing some Scorpio work in 2020 and beyond, which means your transformation, your favorite Scorpio. Uranus turns retrograde in August. Do keep in mind that that's, again, a time when relationships have to change, they have to evolve and have to transform. Mars turns retrograde for you from September to November. It's a time when you can't quite move forward. You have to kind of review and move at a different rhythm. You just might feel like you get your mojo back by November 13th. Saturn, of course, will go back into your 3rd on July 1st, and then by December 17th, it's in your 4th. So you really go into a 2021 where you need to settle down, you need to focus on home and family, and even family responsibilities. Just check in on the questions in the chat. So that's a good question, Heather. You're essentially asking which dates to follow both. I don't know. I have a Gemini moon, so I have no problem doing both. Maybe that's benumching. But maybe if that's too much information for you to follow, focus on the rising sign. But my caveat is that don't neglect the stuff that's happening with your sun sign, because I've seen things happen that's related to the sun sign as opposed to the rising sign. It's kind of these two playing fields that are constantly, things are happening. And it might be hard for us to look at both at the same time. And if that is the case, I would just focus on the rising sign. But but you know, you'll have this recording. You can go back and listen to it and get a new perspective. But yeah, that's a good question, Heather. Sagittarius, yeah, you're coming to a big time, Sagittarius, because the eclipses are going into your sign as well as your relationship sign of Gemini. So 2020 and 2022 will be pivotal years. You know, the second half of this year, relationships might start to take center stage as the nodes go into Gemini and Sagittarius. That said, you're still wrapping up this really powerful story around money, and you know, really needing to show Saturn as Saturn gets to the end of at the end of Capricorn in March. What have you learned about money and value, the power of money, the power of material stability and security, and really taking a serious look at what you're spending your money on, how you're accumulating things. So that's going to be your little report card from Saturn. And then it goes into your third house, and you'll have that 3-month preview of entering a time where focusing on your voice, focusing on how you communicate, how you think, how you learn is going to be a big focus in the next couple of years. With Mars is going to be in what's called your 5th house. So you're going to have this extra long time of feeling, let's say, extra Sagittarius-y. It's a time when you just want to like be big, be bold, express yourself, express your talents, express your abilities. You do have that retrograde, of course, to deal with. So just don't go over the top, which sometimes you do, Sagittarius. So Mars is in your sign, Sagittarius, from January to February. So you feel really, let's say, inspired and motivated to take action and to start a new leaf in the new year. By February, Mars goes into your 2nd house. So it's kind of that Mars is picking up on all this stuff that you've been doing around money and how you earn a living and these deeper themes around value and worth. So do keep in mind what's going on in February and March. Saturn does change signs, of course, in March, and it's going to start to go into your 3rd house. So that's giving you that preview of the next few years, next couple of years. And Mars, of course, is joining Saturn from March until May. By May and June, Mars goes into what's called your 4th house. So it's about home and family and really tending to the roots and foundation of your life. Maybe up until, you know, maybe the first few months of the year, you're really moving at a fast pace, and then things might start to slow down in May. And then, of course, Mars does its thing in your 5th house for basically the half of 2020. So if you have any sort of talent or creativity that you're just ready to share with the world, that might be your time. And then the eclipses are going to start to go into the 7th and 1st house. You're going to start to see those eclipses in Sagittarius and then going into Gemini into November and December. So you are entering a new time in your life. The eclipses, they are going to wrap up in the 2nd and the 8th. You know, I think you've been doing a lot of emotional heavy lifting with these eclipses in Cancer, really facing your fears and having to do a lot of emotional transformation. And then Saturn does go into the 3rd house in December, and then that's a very new time for you. Capricorn and Capricorn rising. Capricorn, it's not been an easy time for you because you've been really dealing with the pressures of Pluto in conjunction with Saturn, your ruling planet. And I think that Capricorn in general is a sign that has a plan, like capital P plan, and you're always working towards it. And maybe this is a plan that you've had for the last 5 years, 15 years, 30 years. But it may mean in 2020 that the plan's no longer working. It could mean in 2020 that the person you thought you were and the life that you thought you were going to live is not the best option anymore. There's something better out there. So you're at a crossroads at a time of rebirth, January possibly, and then February and March, I believe, when Mars gets to Capricorn, just might be times that are really pushing this deep theme forward. That said, you are wrapping up this major chapter in your life that is about bringing new people and new relationship in your life. So really see what's happening with those eclipses in the summer. Saturn's going to give you your report card. I mean, I think that maybe there was a little bit from other astrologers like, oh, Saturn's in Capricorn, great, yay. But I think it just made it extra Capricorn-y for you. And it's been a bit heavy, to be fair. And that said, Saturn's going to give you a little bit of a report card in March. You do enter a time that's about creating increased stability and security in your life and money. So you're going to be working really hard on your money story for those, for 2020 and 2021. But this year is your preview. With the eclipses starting to go into what's called your 6th and 12th house, your physical health and your spiritual health is going to be an increased focus in 2020. And then with Mars and Aries for the second half of 2020, that's the part of your chart that talks about home and family and where you're living and where you're rooted and planted. Mars in that part of your chart is probably not going to be, it's going to be a little bit noisy. So you might move, you might need to move, you might need to make changes in your home. There might be a restlessness in your living situation. It might be a time of new beginnings and new beginnings in your family. But that said, there's going to be a lot of activity happening in the part of your chart that's kind of the most tender, and it really talks about the foundation of you in your life. So things might be moving and shaking in 2020 for you, Capricorn. These eclipses, they're wrapping up in the middle of 2020. They've been putting a lot of pressure on you, a lot of pressure on relationships. I don't, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I have a Capricorn client who, after seeing some relationships leave her life at the beginning of the story, which began in 2018, 2019, she met somebody new. So we'll see, it is about new people coming in. Maybe that's relevant to you as well. Mars does take you behind the scenes in the 12th house for the first 6 weeks of the year. So really rest up, reflect, shed, answer those existential questions. Mars goes into Capricorn from February to March, and it really does activate a lot of this eclipse energy. So if there are some relationship issues, if you do feel like you're at a crossroads and you haven't quite taken action in those areas, Mars will definitely inspire you to take action. So there might be a lot of movement in the first few months of the year for you. Saturn, so Saturn goes into the second house in March. You're going to start to see those themes around money and material stability. And then the eclipses start to go into the 6th and the 12th house from June until December. So you're really, like I said, entering a time that's around material stability, or not material stability, around spiritual health and wellness, and really shedding the past, and really also tending to your physical being. Mars might be quite busy with things from May until June in the 3rd house. Sometimes when Mars is in that part of the chart, you're doing a lot of trips and travel, a lot of places to go and things to do. And then, of course, Mars goes into the 4th house, where it spends the second half of 2020. And then you might be dealing with some old family issues, some things from the past, maybe even some ancestral stuff when Mars goes retrograde. And then, of course, Saturn gets back to the 2nd house in December. And since Saturn is your planet, it rules you. When it goes from Capricorn to Aquarius, you're going to presumably feel it a lot because Capricorn is earth, it's heavy, and then it goes to Aquarius, which is air. So you might feel that shift quite a lot in whether it's from March until July or at the end of this year. December 17th is when it goes into Aquarius finally. Okay, we're getting near the end. Thank you all for being super patient. This is a long webinar. It's always the risk when you're needing to go through all the signs. Aquarius and Aquarius rising, you've been doing a lot of work behind the scenes. All this Saturn-Pluto energy has been happening in what's called your 12th house, which is your psyche, your connection to source, your connection to spirit, needing to let go of a lot of old baggage, especially a lot of old spiritual baggage. Aquarius, what I've been saying to my Aquarius clients, do whatever you don't want to bring with you into the next 30 years of your life, get rid of it now, because when Saturn goes into Aquarius, it's kind of like you're entering a new time in your life, and you're going to get that preview from March until July, but make sure you're doing Saturn proud when you get that report card come March. Uranus is still at the bottom of your chart. I've known a lot of Aquariuses that have been doing big moves, like move across country, move to another country, radically change their living situation. Maybe that's relevant to you. I'm just putting that out there. And then you're entering a time that's really focused on identity, creativity, opening up these talents and expressing who you are. And then with Mars going into your third house, the second half of the year, it's really going to be about you saying something and saying a lot, because like I said, Mars is really strong in Aries. So make sure you're not impulsively saying things that you can't take back when Mars is retrograde, or maybe you're looking at your past with how you use your voice with Mars retrograde. That big Saturn-Pluto conjunction at the start of the year, that's the one that I hope really kind of clears out these old psychic things that you don't want to bring with you into the next part of your life. So Mars is going to spend the first few weeks of the year in your 11th house. So you're going to be connecting with friends, connecting with your social circle, getting out there in the world, and also thinking about these bigger, like, what are your hopes and dreams for the future? Mars goes into the 12th from February to March. It's a time when you typically will go behind the scenes. You're low on energy. Make sure you're taking your vitamins. It's time to rest and recuperate. But it is going to activate all this deep spiritual energy that's been happening with the eclipses. That said, Saturn goes into Aquarius from March until July. So you're in a time where you're on the cusp of a new life. This is why I said, if there's stuff that you don't want to bring with you into the next 30 years, because Saturn talks about 30 years, then how do you get rid of it between now and March? Whether it's an addiction, an old belief, an old emotional pattern, maybe something physical. And then Mars is going to be in Aquarius from May until June. So you might feel very inspired to take action and to go forth in this new part of your life. And that's about money and material stability from May until June. And then maybe from June until December with Mars in your chart. It's just going to be very busy. Typically, you're probably going to be a lot of movement, a lot of travel, a lot of trips, maybe opportunities to learn and take classes in the second half of 2020. The eclipses are going to start to line up with the part of your chart that talks about identity and creativity and self-expression, and maybe having to look at some past themes where you feel afraid to connect, you feel afraid to be with your people, or to feel like people want to be around you. So that might be some of the shadow material that you're working through. And then you're ending this time that's been really focused on health and wellness. Saturn does dip back into the 12th house in July. So you're using July until December to really wrap up these old themes, this old story, this old 29, 30-year story. And then, by December 17th, Saturn goes back into your first house. It's a new life, Aquarius. Last but not least, Pisces and Pisces rising. Thank you everybody for being with me tonight. Pisces, you're wrapping up a major chapter that's focused on community and friendships and belonging. So maybe you've seen a lot of friendships leave your life, Pisces, in the past couple of years, but my hope for you is that you've made some really strong friendships, people that can really stand with you in your life. And so you've built some social networks, you've built some community, and maybe you've had to let go of some old social networks and some old community. Hopefully you've really opened up to expressing who you are and really find the value in who you are and find the value in your creativity. With the eclipses starting to shift into your career sign of Sagittarius and your home sign of Gemini, you are entering a time when you might see a move, change in your professional life, a job change, job opportunities, leaving a job. You will get your 3-month preview from March until July, and before that you'll get Saturn's report card on Saturn's going to check in on how you've been creating a social network, you've been creating friendships, you've been strengthening friendships, and who still needs to go, who's still not supporting you and nurturing you. And then with Mars and Aries in the second half of 2020, it's really about your material life, material stability, material security, making sure you're earning the living that you need to earn, so you can feel very motivated to create more physical security in your life. Jupiter is your ruling planet, and it's in the 11th house for most of 2020, so that means that you're very focused on social networks, friendships, community, maybe politics, maybe social causes, and some of these sort of big picture issues. You are a big picture sign, Pisces. So Mars is in your 10th house from January to February. You're working very hard. You're really launching new professional initiatives, and you're getting out there. By February, it goes into the 11th. It starts to pick up on all this heavy eclipse energy, again, really being discerning about the type of people that you align yourself with, the people you call your friends. Mars is kind of bringing that story to the front. And then by March until May, Mars goes into your 12th house. So this might be a time when you really have to go within, you have to reflect. It might be a time when you're just lower energy. You need to recuperate, you need to go on retreat, you need to meditate, but also nourish your spiritual connections. Saturn also starts to dip into the 12th house from March until July. So do keep in mind, you're entering a time in your life over the next few years. It's 12th house in nature, which is something that you, as a Pisces in general, know all about: spirituality, spiritual connection, mysticism, deeper existential questions. It's a time that's not about the material world, it's about your spiritual world. So that's going to be a big theme going into 2021. The eclipses, like I said, are going into the 4th and 10th. So you're at a crossroads, Pisces. The next couple of years are going to maybe send you in a different direction professionally, maybe a different direction in your home environment. Mars gets into Pisces from May until June. So that's a time when you're going to have a lot more energy, a lot more gusto to kind of go forward and get things done in your life. And then Mars spends a lot of time in your second house, which is interesting because I was just saying that it's not about the material life, it's about the spiritual life. But Mars in the second half of 2020 is all about that material life. Saturn returns to the 11th from July until December, and then it returns to your returns to the 12th, sorry, in December. And Jupiter, your planet, by the way, also will change signs in December, and then we'll go into your 12th house. So 2021 just might be a little bit more of a quiet spiritual time on a more of a macro level. I'm not going to go through this. I'm including this just for the slides, for quick handy reference. This is just a list of the stations and the retrogrades this year. This is your time to ask me questions. And if you have been sitting patiently, I know we've been asking questions as we go. Now's your opportunity. And if you are listening to the replay, send me an email, empoweringastrology@gmail.com. I will do my best to respond to it quickly. I also wanted to toss out an idea to you all, because many of you do repeatedly do my webinars, and some of you are like constantly signing up. Thank you. And I'm going to float the idea of some sort of subscription thing. If you want, I don't know what this looks like yet. I don't know, but if you are interested in a subscription where you get all access to my webinars, you just automatically get signed up, then send me an email. And then I'll kind of have a list of people that are interested, and I can send the information when I have really fully formed it in my brain. But at this point, I'm starting to get a bigger library of materials, and a subscription could even, give you access to all the past webinars. And I'm going to continue to do webinars because I think it's a really great way to interface with you all and teach astrology, which of course is my passion. So thank you. Just stop the share, and I think there is a question. Yes, so that would be yes. That might be a great idea. A friend of mine floated that, and I was like, let me see what people think. So let's just quickly recap, because I know we've been sitting on this call for a little bit over 2 hours. So thank you all for being patient and spending your Tuesday evening with me, or watching the replay whenever you have a chance to watch it. So 2020, it's a year that's going to talk about these bigger structures and systems in our lives. And that might seem abstract, but that might also include the structure of a relationship, the structure of our career, our emotional structures, our psychic structures. So we have to kind of see how we are plugging into things, and how even our own system works. You're going into a year where it is about bigger themes. Saturn's going into Aquarius. It's a time about perhaps social justice, social equity, bigger societal themes, and maybe also themes around science and technology. On a personal level, Aquarius is a sign that talks about our connection to the whole, our connection to society, but even on, kind of bringing it down a few levels, our connection to friendships, our connection to our community. And Aquarius, like all signs, has a shadow, and the shadow that talks about disconnection. So how do we in 2020 start to find connection and really take a look at where we are not in connection? We are disconnected from the system. We are disconnected from the whole. And how do we start to heal that? Because we all need to kind of find our place in the world, and we need to kind of do our personal work and see how are we affecting the system, even the systems in our lives, or even the system on a greater level. It's also a year where we are wrapping up this very profound story around Saturn and Pluto, both of them together in the sky. Capricorn, Saturn will return back to Capricorn in July to wrap up a 2-year story, but you could even say a story that began in 2008. And I'm the type of astrologer that likes to think about big picture, and how a year like 2020 can even be part of a 12-year narrative, and maybe even longer. So we're all continuing to do very profound work in 2020. I know that people are constantly looking for when is it going to get better? I think, and I've said this before, and I'll continue to say it again, and I think the astrology also says this, is that we live in a time in humanity where everything has to change. I don't have to tell you. I think you just need to look at the world and see what's going on, and know that we're in a time where things have to change. So how do we change ourselves? Because we're part of a system, and maybe as we change ourselves, the system changes. So 2020, it's a year that talks about these bigger issues, but I think that we can't, let's say, lose sight of how we are part of that bigger picture. So yes, thank you all for sitting with me tonight and going through the astrology of 2020. It's a lot to digest, but I always enjoy these webinars. I enjoy connecting with you all. Follow me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter, follow me on Instagram. I'm doing kind of weekly videos, giving you a little digest of what's going on in the sky. And then of course you can always book a consultation with me. So again, if you're watching the replay and if you have any questions, do email them to me, empoweringastrology.com. So to all of you who have been watching and also watching the replay, have a wonderful new year. Have a wonderful 2020. Have the courage and bravery to do the personal work that you need to do that helps the system start to find some balance and harmony. So have a wonderful evening and take care. Bye.